Hi everyone, my name is Nigel and I'm not going to talk about Think Right today. Instead, I'm going to talk about the difference between formal and non-formal education. This topic of non-formal and formal education is something I've been thinking about over the last few weeks. And I felt that because I've got experience in both, I would talk a little bit about it here. I consider myself a hybrid. For over 15 years, I've been working in formal education, which typically means going to a Bible college, doing your MA, MTH, PhD, and then becoming a teacher and guiding students to study, write assignments, assess, and then guide them towards their dissertations. So that's usually what is considered formal education. But currently, I've been working for an organization that develops training material for pastors in what is called the grassroots Christianity, which means that not even in urban setups, not even in churches in like main cities, but churches in small rural areas, churches in small towns, how to give them exposure to some things about what the Bible teaches, what are they supposed to know about discipleship, what are they supposed to understand about taking their faith forward, how would we teach that to them? We can't really expect them to come to Bible colleges. So I'm working for this organization that takes the Bible college to them, that takes learning to them. We are developing material that will be useful for them, that they can use this material in their own language and use it as notes, use it as material, as resources that they can learn themselves and teach their congregation. So that is very clearly non-formal education. The focus is not the degree, the focus is not the books that you read, but the focus is learning in your context, something that you really need and it's useful for you so that you can immediately pass it on to the next generation. I've just given you two stereotypical definitions of the word formal and non-formal education, and that's what we usually understand. I do want to highlight the differences between the two. The reason why I'm saying this is because formal and non-formal education is changing a lot. And what people find is that the distinctions between formal and non-formal are constantly changing, are constantly getting stripped away almost. You will find non-formal educational systems, what is traditionally called church-based education or education at grassroots levels, incorporating a few more things from formal education. And at the same time, you'll find formal educational institutions, which are like traditional Bible colleges or seminaries, incorporate elements of non-formal education into their own curriculums and into their own methods. And that's what's happening right now. So it's very difficult to say this is formal and this is non-formal because the lines are getting blurred. But to help a discussion to understand what these institutions are, what are their strengths, what do they have to offer, I've just made a list of differences. This is just to get a conversation going. It's not to say this is the rule and if it doesn't follow this, then that is wrong. These are just from my experience, what I see is formal and what I see is non-formal. We will also see at the end of the video why this is actually a very political issue. There is a lot of conflict around this. And so I'm not trying to say one is better, one is worse. I'm not trying to say that this is it and nothing else, but just a lay of the land. What is non-formal education? What is formal education? And my focus is against Christian non-formal education, what we call non-formal theological education, formal theological education. One of the first differences between formal and non-formal education is to do with location. Where is it being offered? Now, traditionally, typically, formal education expects a student to leave their context and go to a seminary and go to a college. They may be coming from a village or a small town or even in a city, and they go to another city to study God's word, to study how to be a better Christian, and study skills of being a good disciple and disciple maker. For a long time, people would go abroad for that. They would go to the US or the UK to study about God's word. But in India, as you know, there are many more options, and many good options of theological education, but they still require students to leave their contexts and come to this Bible seminary. So you have UTC in Bangalore, SciAx in Bangalore, UBS in Pune, HBI in Chennai, NTC in Dehradun. I mean, these are the places which are like really famous. I'm sure there are many, many more famous colleges, more than I know. But these are places where people leave their cities and go to these colleges to study. So that's traditionally what is considered formal education. Non-formal education, in contrast, is when you study where you are. So your church may be in a small town called Raipur. Maybe Raipur is not that small, but you're in Raipur and you don't want to go to Bangalore to study. So the church organizes their own training program for you. So you don't have to leave your context, you don't have to leave your church, but you are in your church, you're in your context, and you continue to study, perhaps evening classes or something, but you're in your context and studying. So location is one easy way to know the difference between the two. Now, as a counterpoint, these lines are shifting a lot even right now, because after COVID, a lot of Bible colleges are offering online education, distance education, and taking their education into churches. So anybody with a good internet connection can access courses that are offered from any seminary if they're offering online courses. But again, the caveat is that that kind of education is still available to those people who have good internet access. If you don't have good internet access, then you cannot access this formal educational programs. So non-formal education is usually in person, in context, whereas formal education tends to take a person out or of their context. But even when they're bringing their education to the context, there still are very high expectations that there are high demands of time, effort, that is slightly different from the context within which the student exists. Now, but like I said, this is not a hard and fast line. This is just a way of recognizing the difference. The other point about location is that formal education is usually done in English or a dominant language, and non-formal education is usually done in the local language. So for formal education, a student has to know good English, or general must have some knowledge of English. Whereas in non-formal education, they don't need to know any English and they can do their studies in their language. But again, you'll see that formal education can get translated, and non-formal education still relies a lot on English education, because a lot of the material is developed in English and then translated. But that will also show a difference between the two. The second difference between formal and non-formal education is pedagogy, which relates to how the content is taught and assessed. This is a very crucial difference, but you'll see that even here the lines are getting blurred. So formal education will have a very normative curriculum. It will have a strong curriculum that will begin in the beginning, the basics, the introduction, and then it will go to intermediate and then advanced level of studies. Content of formal education is quite heavy. Heavy means it's quite extensive and exhaustive. So anybody who's done a BTH and an MDiv and an MTH will know how much knowledge you're expected to know. Right from the beginning, they will tell you systematic theology, these big books they'll ask you to read. They'll ask you to learn about missions and pastoral theology and biblical studies, Old Testament, New Testament, prophetic books, Gospels, hermeneutics, Greek, Hebrew, Greek advanced, Hebrew advanced, exegesis. You're going to learn so much, and in this, a student can get overwhelmed. So that's one thing about formal education, is heavy content, a lot of content. In contrast, you'll find that non-formal education has an easier curriculum. It's not necessarily easier for a student who may still find it difficult, but it's not so heavy. You'll find the focus a lot on missions or discipleship or basic Bible reading, but they won't be too much on systematic theology, or even if they do systematic theology, they'll simplify it to 10 main principles of theology, like the 10 dominant views of theology. Like, I think there's one organization called UESI, and they do the 10 main theological principles. They don't teach systematic theology in general, they just teach these 10 main points. And like that. So you simplify the larger fields into something smaller and manageable, and then you teach that. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. Huh? This is just to say how formal education tends to be very heavy and exhaustive, whereas non-formal education tends to have a more simpler and straightforward curriculum. Another thing about formal education is assessment. There's a lot of focus on written assignments, reading assignments, paper presentations, grading. Is it A minus, B plus, B? How many marks? Some colleges have a very strong emphasis on examinations, where what you learned will be tested through exams. Whereas in non-formal education, assessment may not be as rigorous as that. There will be some assessment, but it won't be at the level of A minus, B plus, B minus. It may be simpler, like A, B, C, or good, adequate, poor, something like that. They may use simpler assessment, and sometimes even assessment is not about how well you did, but whether you completed the requirements. Yes, you completed the requirements, or you failed to complete the requirements, rather than, oh, you did the requirements very well compared to any other student. So rather than comparative grading, they focus on the student's work. There's also emphasis on portfolios in some non-formal education, where your work is assessed, rather than your output, what you did, like some project or some activity you did, rather than what assignment you wrote. So that's another identification of formal and non-formal. But again, the lines are getting blurred. You'll find that non-formal education is also becoming more creative in terms of assignments, is allowing more oral presentations, assessing projects, even portfolios. Whereas you will find non-formal education, which will have assignments, like some places will require written assignments, some places will require you read at least 1 or 2 articles. So like I said, the lines are blurred, but traditionally you'll see a difference in both pedagogy, how they teach, as well as how they assess. Within pedagogy, you'll also find a difference in time frame, by when you finish. So non-formal education tends to be a bit more open, long-term, lifelong, whereas formal education has a begin date and an end date. You have to finish your program within 3 to 5 years. If not, your credits will expire, or at the end of 2 years, you'll get 1 degree. At the end of 3 years, you'll get another degree. Like that. They're very hard, clear lines of completion, start and completion. Whereas non-formal education, you could start with 1 degree, or you could start with 1 certificate and then go on to another certificate or another paper, and then you do a little bit more, 2-day workshop or 10-day workshop, or then suddenly you go for 1 month. Like that, and it's not clear when you start and when you finish. Of course, there will be an end, but that end date is not so consistent. Like everybody finishes, there's a graduation day on the April 5th. It's not like that. It's more like when you finish, you finish. So that's another thing about formal and non-formal. One tends to be more flexible in terms of time. The other one tends to have a more clear time frame, begin and end. Another difference between formal and non-formal education is accreditation. Now, this is really important, because what you'll find is that formal education's bread and butter, as they say, the main thing of formal education is accreditation, of how these degrees are valued. Are they of an international standard? Who recognizes them? Can you use these degrees for further education? Are these degrees valued so that you can get a job, whether you can do further studies, whether you can get a promotion on the basis of these degrees? And the degrees can be BTH or MDiv or MTH or PhD. These are degrees that are offered and accredited by organizations. So not just somebody can just say, oh, I'm going to give you an MDiv. The organization that is accrediting you, who is deciding that you get an MDiv? Who is deciding that you're getting a DTH or a PhD? Who decides that you get an MTH? The accrediting agency is a very important part of formal education. And you will find that most formal educations have good accrediting systems. They may be better, they may be others, but you'll find that accreditation is an important factor of formal education. In non-formal education, you'll see largely programs that are not accredited. So an organization like ATA, Asia Theological Association, will have strong links with formal education, whereas many churches or many non-formal bodies may not be accredited by ATA, may not even be acceptable to ATA, but they are still offering some education, which may be consistent with ATA principles, but they don't have a building, or they don't have accredited teachers, or they don't have a solid curriculum, so they cannot get an ATA degree. And their degrees are not valid for ATA. So if let's say a student has done 5 years of non-formal education, and they were to say, come to an ATA college and say, I want to do my MTH because I've done 5 years of studies, the college may not give them admission on that basis to an MTH because that 5 years are not accredited by ATA. I mean, then you have colleges like Serampur that don't even value ATA degrees, but that's a separate story. But I'm saying that accreditation is a very important part of formal education. The lines are getting blurred again because non-formal education is getting some accreditation. You'll find that non-formal education systems will either find special accrediting bodies that accredit non-formal education, or they will create their own accrediting bodies. And where a group of non-formal education institutions will say, let's accredit ourselves, let's have a consistent policy. And that's also starting to become more common, where they do have accreditation, but it may not be globally recognized in the same level of formal education. But that is one distinction between formal and non-formal, but it's also starting to get blurred because you have non-accredited programs starting to get accredited as well. So that's just another differentiation. Oh, one more thing about accreditation is, in strongly accredited colleges, only accredited teachers can teach in those accredited colleges. So remember I mentioned about the Serampur and ATA, I made a joke about it. An ATA teacher cannot teach in Serampur. Like, I've got a degree from ATA, I cannot teach in a Serampur college because I don't have a Serampur degree. I'm not accredited by Serampur. In the same way, if an ATA college was to get a teacher, they need to get at least an MTH or a PhD level teacher. They cannot just get a person who's just a pastor and say, I'm a pastor who knows a lot of work. No, you need to show where is your degree and is that degree accredited. So the teachers are also accredited. It's not just the program, but even the teachers. Whereas in non-formal education, you will find many students who are pastors, who are studying, and at the same time, they're also teachers. And you'll see this is very common in places where Christianity is very small, very young, and there are very few Christians. The pastor is learning and teaching at the same time. So there's no time to wait for accreditation. You cannot say non-formal education, you have to spend 5 years learning, only then you can start teaching. No, the urgency is like there's already a church formed, 20 people, 30 people. They are also becoming pastors themselves. What are you going to do? So you can't tell the pastor to wait. They want to start teaching already. So you teach the pastor quickly and you help the pastor teach as well. So that's another distinction, accreditation. A fourth distinction, and this is a very popular distinction, is the distinction of outcomes. What is the result of the program? Now, traditionally, non-formal education focused on behaviors or practice, learning to do something, whereas formal education was theory, knowledge, and learning to know something. So most formal education institutions will have an exam or papers or a dissertation, and that is the output, that is the outcome of your work. Whereas in non-formal education, the exam or the paper is not the outcome. The outcome is, have you spread the gospel? Have you helped your church grow? Have you helped a person become a better Christian? Those are the outcomes. So they are more practical and more visible in life and in the life of the church. Whereas the outcomes from traditional Bible colleges of formal education, the outcomes are your work, your articles, your written theoretical work output. Of course, the written work could be practical. It'll say the church needs to do, or this is how we apply. But the immediate outcome is theoretical. That's the traditional. The counterpoint is that now more formal institutions are realizing that they need to incorporate more practical assessment, practical outputs, bring in more context and contextual understandings and contextual application in their work. This is not consistently applied, but it is happening. And you'll find some colleges have a whole year of ministry exposure for students where they have to spend going out in a village or in a small town, either preaching or teaching, and then they come back and continue their education. So engaging with the context and coming back into study is part of their work. So that's how the formal education has been including non-formal elements in it. Now, this is not to say that non-formal education is only practical. You will find some non-formal education actually have emphasis on theology, how to read the Bible, introduction to Old Testament, New Testament. I remember a pastor who was saying, we need to teach every single book of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. So we need to teach, so the content is like 69 books they have to read and learn and understand and be able to preach from. Now that's a lot of content. It's not simply practical application, but they have to learn, they have to study, they have to read and perhaps write or at least preach about it. And so it's not that non-formal does not have theoretical outcomes. In fact, there are places that have, like I mentioned about UESI, they teach this 10 main principles of theology. That is something you study. You have to study it. So non-formal education does have study and theory, though typically the focus is more output, like practical output. Whereas in formal education, typically, though not exclusively, the focus is on your theoretical output, your written assignments, and so on and so forth. So far, we've seen the differences between formal and non-formal education as location, as pedagogy, which includes time frame, accreditation, and also outcomes. So these are the ways that non-formal and formal are different. Another difference will also be, and there are many more differences, is the cost. You'll find that non-formal education tends to be cheaper and almost costing nothing compared to formal education, which will always have a cost. Living expenses, tuition fees, cost of resources. So that's another thing. But like that, there are many other differences, but just pointing out those four main ones. So which were location, pedagogy, which includes time frame, curriculum, assessment, then accreditation, and also outcomes. So these were the general differences. Now, why are we talking about it? What is this? What is the problem? What's the big deal? Let formal education exist. Let non-formal education exist. Who cares about what is the difference? And the reason why the difference is important, you can say that there is a political challenge happening nowadays. And sadly, it has to do with politics. It has to do with value. It has to do with voice, who gets to speak. It could have to do with funding. It could have to do with leadership, influence, like that. So what we're finding is that traditionally, over the last 100 years, formal education has dominated theological education. So you'll find going to a college the normal thing that you're supposed to do. If you want to be a preacher or a missionary or a pastor, you have to go to Bible college. You have to go and study. This is for the last 100 years, maybe 150. But before that, for the past 1900 years or 1800 years, before formal education really took root, all our education, not all, but most of our education was non-formal, was without the degree. A lot of it was going to learn from your learning in your church context. Your pastor was your main teacher, applying what you taught in home groups or in the home setting or in the monastery. Even if you do that, it wasn't a degree orientation, but it was more life learning, living in the context, cooking, cleaning, serving was all part of education. But over the last 100 years, formal education has really dominated learning and dominated theological learning at a mass level. Like anybody now wanted to do becoming a pastor needs to go to Bible college. That's becoming like a standard. Whereas 500 years ago, unless you're from the Catholic Church, you didn't have to go to Bible college. You could just read the Bible and you could become a pastor. I'm talking about the Reformation and the post that, not talking about the training that the Catholic priests had to go through, which could be considered formal education. But we are talking about generally how learning happened for lay people. Today, lay people can go to Bible colleges and learn and study. Now, so the problem lies is that over the last, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years, there's a huge growth in Christianity, but also recognition that the West is not enough, does not give us the right answers, but neither is going to a city a valid option for us. So let's say if I am in a small town called Raipur, it's not a small town, but let's say I'm from Raipur, why do I need to go to Bangalore to study? Why do I need to go to Chennai to study? What if I just study in Raipur? I'm working in my church, I know my language, I know Hindi, I want to speak to my Hindi congregation. Why should I have to learn English to study the Bible? Why can't that come to me? So this shift that is happening, this need from the churches is leading to a requirement from the churches to have education. And many of the churches are creating their own programs. And they're creating their own learning systems that may or may not have accreditation. But they're saying, look, we need to teach our own people. So what is happening to that Raipur student? He's not coming to Bangalore. He is not coming to Chennai or to Dehradun to study. So the big colleges may potentially lose students. They're getting less applicants. So therefore, they need to learn from the context, learn from the churches. And the churches are saying, we want education. Bring it to us. So now these colleges are saying, okay, here's our program through distance, through online education. Here is a program for you in a way that you could understand. So that's one big shift that is happening. So formal education is trying to define itself as, yes, we are relevant even in the non-formal sectors. Now, in contrast, the non-formal people are looking at these formal people and saying, look, you're still irrelevant. You're still coming to our places, but you're expecting us to do this. You're saying you are only accredited people can teach, but I'm the pastor of this church and I cannot teach because I don't have an MTH. So the non-formal education is also not agreeing with this shift. And they are saying, no, we will create our own programs because that is relevant for us. What you have been teaching for the last 50, 100 years is not relevant to what is happening in the last 10 years in my place. So we need our own educational systems. And so for that, a lot of people are creating on-the-fly material that is useful for you, that is useful to teach. And so there seems to be this conflict where non-formal is saying, look, we need our own identity, and formal is saying, we can help you, we can provide you solutions as long as you follow our rules and our systems. So this conflict that is happening between formal and non-formal is dividing how Christianity is right now manifesting in the developing world. In the developed world, like we've talked about the US or UK, these questions will not be so important as much as in Africa, Latin America, India, China, where what is the legitimacy of a pastor who does not have an MTH? What if I've been a pastor for 20 years without any theological degree, but my church is thriving, my church is growing, but I don't have an MTH degree. So if I go to the city, nobody will allow me to speak, nobody will give me any bhav, as they say in Hindi. They'll not give me any value because I don't have a degree. But the person called to preach or teach will be, oh, here is Reverend so-and-so, or here is Dr. so-and-so, or he is from this Bible college. And so we value only the people who are accredited, but the person who's done the work, lived in context, does not get the same value. So formal and non-formal are trying to address this problem. It's sometimes antagonistic, but sometimes there's also dialogue. And sometimes there's also, let's cooperate, let's learn from one another. So let's understand what our differences are, let's understand our strengths, and let's also understand how we can help one another. So that in that context, it's important to understand what is formal and what is non-formal education, and hoping that there is better dialogue between these two learning institutions, though there's no real two, because every formal educational institute is different from another. But in a general sense, can our formal Bible colleges and seminaries help our non-formal educational systems? And can non-formal educational systems benefit from the formal systems and still find relevant, useful program for themselves? So in that view, with that concern, I've made this video. It doesn't solve anything, but at least it gives us language to talk about this. I hope you found this useful. Until the next video, bye-bye.